to be true. So along the lines of things I wish people had read and been exposed to separate from, as you say, the political bubble and the way most voters think, I just wondered if you could think of sort of 2 or 3 books or resources that you wish more people involved in political campaigning had read or been exposed to. So not necessarily political texts, but things to do with the psychology of persuasion or strategy or how to just manage a campaign team. Is there anything that comes to mind that you wish more campaigners had read?
So the first of them is a more straightforwardly political book. It's called Talking to a Brick Wall by Deborah Mattinson, who is a Labour Party pollster. And she has done focus groups for decades now. And she tells the story of Labour's recovery from 1983 through to the 1997 landslide and beyond. And that's a very familiar story that's told in lots of books. But she tells it through the eyes of focus group participants. So the normal story that gets told is through the eyes of Peter Mandelson or Tony Blair and so on. And through the eyes of the voters is such a good reminder of how differently voters see things. And there's this really good example at the beginning where focus group members are asked to describe the Labour Party, what a Labour MP would look like. And it's a man with a bowler hat and a pipe. This was a sort of early 80s views. And that, in a way, was like what Labour had to change. And it really reminds you how much of politics is about things other than the sorts of details you get in fascinating political memoirs. Great, though, for example, Peter Mandelson's The Third Man is. And I never quite work out whether the title of that is wonderfully self-deprecating or hugely arrogant. It's maybe a bit of both. So that's one I would recommend. Second, I think, would be just having a look at a few books I've got to my right here. I mean, I guess it's the classic How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, because it's surprising how many candidates are not very good at being charming. You know, and particularly at local council level, there's something about, there would be an amazing study for someone to do to understand the mindset of people who are introverted yet attracted to being a councillor. And many of them make amazing councillors, but there is something a bit curious about that. And that's why, you know, in the various, say, emails I get as, you know, party president from Lib Dem councillors around the country and so on, I mean, lots of them are really, you know, even when they're quite angry, are very, you know, well put together, etc. But there's a definite strain where you just think, I'm not quite sure you quite know how you come over to other people and so on. So I think How to Win Friends and Influence People is a really important skill, and it's one that is in shorter supply than you might expect in political parties quite often. And then I think the third I would pick, I'm trying to think of sort of what makes a good mix of topics. I think it's, I'm trying to remember the title. I'm just going to reach for my keyboard to find the title, but it's a book by Paul Tyler, a former Liberal Democrat MP. And what he did was he took a very old pamphlet about how committees work. And he basically did an updated version of it interspersed with his own sort of reminiscences. Yeah, it's called Who Decides by Paul Tyler. And so the sort of the bits that he intersperses makes it a bit like a sort of reading equivalent of an after dinner speech. So quite a few laughs, but quite a little bit of knowledge sort of worked in. And I'm just having a look. Yeah, there's a guide. It was a guide published in 1962 about understanding, managing and exploiting committees. And so he interleaves sort of after dinner anecdotes with extracts from that. And so it makes for a really good little book about how to have success, because a lot of being a successful politician is committee work, whether that's internal committee work, whether it's councils, whether it's, hey, if you end up being a cabinet minister. So I think those would be my three. And if prompt me if I forget, Matthew, but I can send the details of all those three to maybe email around to people afterwards if that's useful as well.
Oh, that would be brilliant. I think we might end this session with a bit of a hands up about what we'd like to read next. We've had a few suggestions over the last few weeks. So I've been told to call the next person strictly by the name of Audrey, which I'll now stick to. So there you have it. Over to you. I believe you are muted.
I can't unmute.
You may have to hold down the space bar while you talk.
We'll come back.
You want to try, if you try and sort that out.
I will.
So I will field a pre-submitted question from Tamsin, if that's all right. You did ask, how important is it to keep engaged and have local scale events, such as well as surveys, to keep people up to date, on what matters to constituents over the next 4 years in prep for the next Westminster election?
Yeah, the short answer, very important. I guess the slightly longer answer is, it goes back to that point about how many people didn't know who Theresa May was.
Yep.
That especially in areas where local media is in decline, which is most bits of the country, sadly, there is often a real information gap. And so there is a real opportunity and even need for example, political parties to help fill that gap in terms of explaining what's going on and why. And there was a good example of this a couple of years back where I live, where the council, Labour-run council, had set up a local energy company. And, you know, it's one of these things that's become a little bit of a trend in the last few years, of sort of municipal local energy companies. And the Labour Party was saying how wonderful it was. The Liberal Democrats were saying how awful it was. The local newspaper covered the story, but it was basically covered in a Punch and Judy, he said this, she said that type way, that didn't really leave anyone with any real way of judging, you know, is this a good thing, is this a bad thing, unless you were already a Labour or a Lib Dem hardcore supporter and thought, well, my side's bound to be right. And so there's often, you know, a real gap in people's knowledge and local information, that it's actually beneficial for society as well as beneficial for the party that's doing it, but it's beneficial to fill. And so I think that's one reason why I say yes. I guess just briefly, a second reason I'd say yes is that people generally take part in voluntary activities, and actually this even applies to paid employment as well, is because in part it's fun and they like the people they're working with and it's enjoyable. And a key part of that is events and meetings. And actually, I think particularly as, you know, lockdown eventually finally eases, political parties organising social events will be one of the ways that we can meet each other again and interact with each other again. So I think doubly important for that reason as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. We can go back to Audrey. You're unmuted now.
I'm unmuted. I don't usually read books about politics, but I read this one mainly because I found it so intriguing. It was the way you talked about writing the book, but you didn't talk about the way you wrote the book. And I thought that having each chapter and then a quotation from someone was excellent. I read the chapter and then, you know, I thought about it, and then I read the blurb, but I thought that the format of it was great, with the heading for the chapter and then the quotation, which was lovely. And you had quotations, well, you had 100 quotations. And I thought that there were quotations from all sorts of people, even from Cicero and people like that. Lots of people from America, lots of people from England, of course.
Yeah.
And I thought that the way that it was arranged made you want to go on. You read the you read the quotation, and then you read the explanation, and then you thought, I'll just turn over to the next page. And it was really intriguing the way you did it. So were you conscious of that? That it was a really good readable book.
That's lovely of you to say. Thank you. I'm really glad to hear you enjoyed it. I guess in a way, perhaps that style of the book is a reflection of what is a wider sort of benefit in life when we can get this right, which is it's always a good idea if we can pick things where our weakness becomes a strength. And I'm not going to go too much into sort of martial arts philosophy here, but that obviously is one area where it comes up. But by what I mean is, when Ed and I talked about writing the book, we were quite concerned about would we have enough time to write it. And so we deliberately tried to figure out, is there a subject matter and is there a topic where our weaknesses, as in, will we have enough time? But, on the other hand, we're used to writing short stuff. None of us had written a full-length book before, etc., where our weaknesses could become a strength. And so in this case, okay, if we can think of a structure where lots of short bits works. Oh, hang on a minute, 101 thing, and that's the sort of style of book. So I think that's applicable to political messaging in general as well, because this is the thing that one of the things the Conservatives have been very good at over the last century or so is turning a weakness into a strength. A weakness being seen as a bit heartless can become a strength if it's seen as will just take the tough decisions to get the job done. And so if you look at how Tory election victories have often been based on, however much we may agree or disagree with this, but often been based on a perception of economic competence. At the heart, it's been people thinking, yeah, they're not as caring as I would like them to be, but at least we'll have the money to be able to afford to be caring if it's them running the economy. And obviously we are very often very passionately disagreed with that view, but you can see how that turning a weakness into a strength works, has worked for them, and it gives it a degree of credibility. And, the genius of the New Labour revamping of the Labour Party was to understand, actually, we've got a weakness that we can't turn into a strength. So we have to really overhaul the party from top to bottom to address that head on. And for us, in the Liberal Democrats, the weakness in a way is that the public often view us as just a bit nice. And there are circumstances where that's a real weakness, as in, you're just a bit nice, might be a bit soft, might be a bit of a pushover, etc. But there are circumstances in which that can be a strength, and so we need to frame things in a way that where we're more likely to be pushing with the grain and making that a positive thing. The other thing I would say is that if any of you are thinking about writing a book, is I'd really encourage you to give it a go. I am tremendously lucky in my hit rate of book ideas turning into being published, because I think what interests me are niches that are sufficiently rare that it's a lot easier to get published than if I say was interested in writing detective fiction. But whether it's just for the enjoyment of it, or whether it's because you end up going down the self-publishing route, or whether it's because you hit lucky with being able to publish it in a traditional way, I'd definitely encourage people to give it a whirl.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I personally find that also sort of a nice spur on a Saturday morning for my projects. We've got a few minutes left and a few people are going to have to be shooting off. I'm going to ask for one thing I normally save right until the end, is I'm going to get you all to look at the camera and smile. I'm going to mess it up myself because I'm always looking down towards the corner so we can grab a picture for next time.
Am I allowed to hold my book while?
Yes, please do. There we have it.
Oh, I like you, Neil.
Sorry. A few of you now have it. Go on. I'll snap again. There's 4 on screen. Go on. That's brilliant.
Excellent.
That's how book club should look, I suppose. Marvelous. Well, I'd like to jump to Ree because you've got to shoot off next. If I can put you on to ask your question.
Yeah, I do. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, first, thank you, Mark. Really interesting to hear from you about writing the book, and thanks, Matt, for bringing us from 4 people to this epic congregation today. So I was interested in the fact that the effect of the way you wrote the book was that you ended up with something bite-sized and readable, but to the heart of each issue in each chapter. And I think from an overarching perspective, what you're saying is the heart of good campaigning is understanding what voters think. What I've heard from Ed separately is probably more applicable to candidates, but one of the kind of hearts of being a good candidate is being authentic. Are there any other kind of overarching heart of the issue points about either campaigning or running that you'd like to leave with us?
Yeah, well, you've mentioned 2. Obviously, I've got another 99 I could mention.
Of course.
I'm just trying to think. I guess and I sort of touch on this a little bit in the sort of the 90s in part 5 in the book, is that being a successful candidate and being a successful politician, you know, if elected, requires learning a lot of things. And the best and the most successful people are happy to keep on learning. And that might sound fairly obvious, but because politics in part attracts people who are quite opinionated very often, it's not as obvious and as widespread a mindset as perhaps it should be. And in particular, I remember many years ago at a regional conference, there was somebody who was objecting to the party's then candidate approval process and how outraged they were that they had, rather than being approved, they had been sort of half approved and were told they had to do mandatory speech-making training. And I remember sitting there thinking, the speech you're giving right now, I mean, it's okay, but it's not brilliant. Why are you outraged at the thought that somebody might think you can give a better, you could get better at giving a speech, when self-evidently you could get better at giving a speech? And that really stuck in my mind as an example of how we should always be thinking, how can we do things better? Because in the end, pulling off, say, a win at a general election, particularly for a party like ours, which has so few safe seats, is a phenomenal achievement. And it's not a criticism of anyone at all to say, you know what, on day one, when you try to head off down that road, you're probably not going to have the skills you'll need by the time you get to success. But also, and this is perhaps the key personality test, is some people relish that thought. Oh, brilliant, I can learn new things. I'm going to get better at stuff along the way. If that's your reaction to it, then, things are looking good. If your reaction is, no, I already know how to do stuff, maybe actually that isn't the road for you.
I'll put my question to the back of the queue. Holly, if do you want to jump in with yours? It's still currently muted. Hold on, there we go.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I just on that point you just made. Actually, the question isn't on that, but I thought that was. I've been thinking a lot recently. I'm a counsellor in Hull, and I really wish actually that I had more training about sort of things like speech making, writing emotion. That would have been that actually would have been really helpful, and I hope something that we can look at moving forward. So my question was mainly about it was sort of partly inspired by thinking about I think in one of the earlier chapters you said 3 types of like bad candidates. I can't remember what the 2 of them were, but one of them that really stuck out to me was the martyr. Like, if I remember correctly, that was basically, you know, thinking that you were right and everyone else was wrong.
Yep.
But yeah, and I think I've definitely been guilty of that in the past. When I've not really understood why. That's something that's really been bothering me recently, is why more people are angry about the government's response to COVID-19. And I suppose my question really was how we sort of approach that, because I think there should be an inquiry. I think the handling of it has been dreadful. I think, you know, lots of people have died. The economy's been hit. And the government's own sources have said that part of the reason for that is because they knew in 2016 we were woefully unprepared for a pandemic, and they chose to instead prepare for a no-deal Brexit. And they were worried about shutting everything down because, again, the economy had already been hit by Brexit. So obviously that's something that's a matter of fact, not a matter of opinion. They've said that themselves. I was just wondering how you think we should approach that in our campaigns, because there are going to be a lot of people who are angry, but there are going to be a lot of people that's going to really turn off as well if we seem to be really attacking the government.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, because people want reassurance, and it is a very understandable, desirable human trait that people don't want to be petrified that they might die tomorrow. And so when a government is doing things wrong and is increasing the chance overall that, you know, some people somewhere might die, they both need to be held to account for that, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't inappropriately stoke up people's fears. And so I think a lot of this is about timing, which is that we can concentrate much more on the provision of information and concentrate much more on the asking of questions that are framed as helping to push those in power to be making the right decisions, and leave the more finger-pointing recrimination type debates till afterwards. And I think it's not, you know, we definitely should get to the, well, what went, you know, did something go wrong? Almost certainly, yes. Why did it go wrong? How did it go wrong? Who's to blame? We definitely need to get to that. But I think we need to remember in the interim that it is a very fine balancing act between saying things might not be going right and saying to somebody, you should be much more scared than you think you are as to what's going to might happen to you or your family tomorrow. And that and it's a difficult one. I think what is also important to bear in mind, and we've already begun to see this, is just how quickly public and how much public opinion can move. You know, the classic example until this year, I guess, that I would have cited was the first President Bush. Sky high popularity at the time of the first Gulf War in the US, then very unusually for an incumbent president seeking election, lost his re-election bid. You know, so the public opinion can move massively, but we should be a little bit patient in that respect, particularly because there's not going to be a general election next month. It would be very different if, say, there was, and that would be really difficult to get right. But as there isn't going to be a general election, there aren't going to be council elections next month. A little bit of patience, a little bit of care and decorum over timing is crucial.
Right. Well, I think I might ask a question of my own as sort of organiser's privilege, and then I think we might wrap it up, because I think people will be starting to think about their lunch tables. So at the end of one of the chapters, you write, the perfect team is a candidate who's 100% sure of winning, and a campaign manager who's 100% sure of losing.
Yeah.
I do think that's a great team, unless when in my case they happen to be left and right side of your brain. So what do you recommend for getting around this? You know, when you find yourself to be both campaign manager and candidate?
I guess ideally to recruit someone else to be one of those two. and the reason, I mean, I particularly when, you know, it was sort of, in many ways, I guess I made my reputation as a campaigner in the party over sort of 8 years or so in Hornsey and Wood Green, where we went from having never won any election of any sort and being a very distant third place, to 2 general elections in a row having one of the best results in the country, and therefore getting Lynn elected as MP. And at the heart of it, really, there was a team of 3 of us: myself, Neil the agent, and Lynn the candidate. But particularly, I think what worked really well between Lynn and myself, Neil was absolutely crucial to it, but, you know, in terms of this particular question, was that the confidence that Lynn had is what motivated members. It's what persuaded donors to give money. It's also, frankly, what kept her going as well, I'm sure. My utter conviction that things could always go wrong is what drove us to do things on a scale that we never before thought possible. And that both of those are really important. And I think you're absolutely right. It's really hard to do both of them at the same time as one person. Now, it may be that if you're, say, in a slightly easier electoral position, the tension between those two matters a lot less. In fact, it definitely matters a lot less, you know. So it can be reconcilable within a person, but it may be. But one answer is to try and have a slightly bigger team, and therefore you can split it out. The other is to make sure you have as a sounding board somebody who can essentially be whichever one of those other two roles you need. And that may be, you know, it may be a partner, it may be a relative, it may be a party colleague, it may be a lifelong friend, whatever. But somebody who can be your sounding board and who knows that, as it were, their role that they can play to be your friend, relative, support, maybe to flip between the, you know, the two different types of sounding boards depending on the situation, because that real desire to push yourself, I mean, is, you know, if we're trying to pull off a hard electoral result, it's a bit like setting up a company or being a winning sports person. You know, that psychology is an important part of it. And I guess I would just add to say, I think one element, which I don't talk about in the book, but I think you saw a bit of at the 2019 election, is the most successful candidates are those who, in a way, take the view that they want and demand and expect the party to properly support and help them, but that if they at any point are feeling let down in that respect, their reaction is to say, sod it, I'm going to win anyway, as opposed to, that's appalling, I'm going to walk away. And actually, if you feel like you're not being supported as much as you should be, it's very legitimate to take the sod it, I'm going to walk away approach. It is, for all sorts of reasons, for better and for worse, though, the case that you'll probably run into that at least once at some point, and therefore the sod it, I'm going to show them and I'm going to do it anyway. That's the characteristic, that's the personality trait, that's the one that you much more often see amongst those who are successful in politics.
That's true.
Brilliant. We actually do have one sort of rounding question from Tamsin, which is picks up on the sort of Lib Dem point about leafleting. I will say, just for all our viewers, we actually do have your co-author, Mark, joining for an interview about a
brilliant
interview, and we may even turn it into a bit of a news review spelt UE on the end rather than something too serious. Tamsin asks, although leafleting is important and reaches certain voters, with the Lib Dem party being conscientious about climate change and environmental issues, what other sources are available, as well as social media and news, that we can reach more voters or reach the voters?
So, I mean, the amount of paper involved in our leaflets is actually trivial. And, you know, it might not feel like that if we've done a really intensive campaign. But if you pile up those number of bits of paper, it's less than a weekly local newspaper, the number of sheets of paper in that. It's the amount of paper is actually quite small in that, you know, if you compare it to a book or one edition of a newspaper or also. So I think definitely we should make sure that we're using you know, recycled paper where we can, and actually the environmental impact of different types of ink can vary massively and so on. But I think we should be comfortable with the volume of paper in that sense. And one thing that, for example, Halifax Liberal Democrats have started doing is they basically plant a tree for each sort of focus print run they do, as a bit of environmental offsetting that way. So that's good. The big advantage, though, of letterboxes as well is that we basically know where every letterbox is. Not quite, there often is just that one that you can never find, but we basically know where every letterbox is. And we have legal permission to go and put something through it. And that gives a huge advantage to leafleting compared to other campaign tactics. So email campaigning, massively important. but it's a real long-term battle to build up a big enough email list. So letterboxes have a value. I think the three key channels, in a way, if you had to pick three, one is the letterbox, because we can get everywhere. The second is canvassing, because if you want to persuade people of something, the in-person conversation, whether it's on the doorstep or on the phone, perhaps increasingly on the phone, at least for the time being, given coronavirus, is important. And the third is the letterbox, because we can get everywhere. Now, if I was to then expand the list to 4 or 5, that's where absolutely digital channels are really important. But in many ways, the real power of things like email and Facebook and Twitter and so on is helping recruit helpers and mobilize and motivate helpers to do the first 3. Now, the direct audiences that we can reach through digital channels as we build up are hugely valuable. But the main gains very often are, yes, it's quite nice that we have a few hundred residents on an email list, and in a very close result that can make a difference, but it's the few hundred supporters who we are mobilizing to go out and reach thousands of residents that makes the big difference. The final thing I would just say on this is that it's much less a matter of choosing between one or the other than I think sometimes people think. Because, if you're, say, the candidate, then definitely you have a direct choice. I can spend 2 hours this afternoon canvassing or leafleting or sending email. You do have a choice. But more broadly, in terms of getting more people involved, there are not that many people, as we build a bigger team, who are genuinely as good and as happy to do any of those different things. And so as you build a bigger team, part of success in that is letting people do what they're best at and what they most enjoy doing. And so it's not so much, should this new helper be told to canvass or send emails or deliver leaflets? It's, hello, new helper, what would you like to do? And whichever one of the 3 is great. If that's the thing they're going to do most, let's get them doing that. So it's much less of a choice. Obviously, it's a bit of a choice if you're the candidate. It's a bit of a choice if we're thinking about budgets. But fundamentally, we should be driven by flexing what we do to help motivate more people to be involved, because that will result overall in more activity and more impact and more election victories.
Brilliant. Well, can I just say thank you very much on everyone's sort of behalf for joining us on this Saturday morning. I don't think we've got any more questions, so I'm going to sort of wrap it up there. What I will ask, we've had a few sort of book suggestions of all sorts. People have messaged me. Does anyone have a book suggestion off the top of their head for next time? We're open to political fiction. We're open to autobiographies. But anything around the larger theme of campaigning. Or Mark, maybe you've even got a suggestion for us yourself.
If you want a novel that has some political overtones that are still very relevant, I would suggest Karl Čapek's The War with Newts. So Karl Čapek is most well known for inventing the word robot. But The War with Newts is a sort of almost a bit like Animal Farm. It's a political satire set in a sort of slightly fictionalized world. In his case, it's one in which intelligent newts are discovered, and just the way humans interact with them. There are loads of parallels with issues about internationalism, war, immigration, racism. The themes that he sketched, he touches on in his book then are very relevant now. It must be close to a century on from it, and it's a fun, readable story. So you don't get buried in dull worthiness on every page. It's a very readable story that you can then think, oh, hang on a minute, there's a parallel here. So it's quite like Animal Farm in that respect.
Brilliant.
I'm not sure many people read Animal Farm as just a story about animals, but if you know what I mean, you don't have to be thinking about which one is Trotsky on every page. You can enjoy reading it and then ponder that afterwards.
Brilliant. Well, what I'll do is I'll send out a few suggestions. I think we might even have one non-fiction, one autobiography, and one one non-fiction read, which isn't an autobiography, for next time, and those will be on separate dates. So, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you once again, Mark. I will email update everyone with what's happening in the future. So yes, thank you. Have a
Thank you.
nice rest of your weekend.
Lovely talking to you all. Take care.